Hollywood is in absolute panic right now, and that statement is not hyperbole, exaggeration, or clickbait. It is a quiet, unmistakable reality spreading behind closed doors. Beneath the polished smiles, the choreographed red carpet appearances, the rehearsed late-night interviews, and the carefully curated public personas, something far more revealing is taking place. Fear. Not manufactured outrage, not social media backlash that can be managed by publicists and crisis teams, but genuine fear, raw, personal, and deeply unsettling. It is moving through the entertainment industry's most powerful circles like an electric current. In recent hours, Mel Gibson has issued what many are describing as a final and chilling warning, and its effect has been immediate. This was not a casual comment or a vague implication. It landed with weight. Shockwaves are now moving through Hollywood in silence rather than headlines. What Gibson revealed about the Epstein files, the deeply entrenched elite power structures, and secrets buried for decades is not simply disturbing, it is destabilizing. This is not the kind of information that trends for a day and disappears. This is the kind of revelation that rewrites history, collapses carefully maintained illusions, and threatens systems that were never meant to be questioned. Whether people are prepared or not, this is a story that refuses to remain buried. Over the past several days, the internet has been overwhelmed by a relentless surge of revelations, each one compounding the last. What began as online speculation has escalated into something far more serious. It started with the explosive Diddy documentary, a project that peeled back layers of secrecy surrounding his inner circle and validated suspicions that had circulated quietly for years. Conversations once dismissed as rumors suddenly gained credibility. Names, patterns, and behaviors that were once off-limits began entering mainstream discussion. Almost immediately afterward, the Epstein files, documents the public has been demanding, requesting, and waiting on for more than a decade, were finally released. Many believed this would bring closure, accountability, a sense of finality. Instead, it did the opposite. Rather than closing the chapter, the files opened a far darker door, revealing just how much of the story had been withheld. What Mel Gibson has now brought to the surface connects these events in a way that no longer feels accidental. The timing is too precise. The overlaps are too consistent. What once appeared to be isolated scandals now resemble fragments of a much larger structure, one that is only now beginning to crack under its own weight. The Epstein files were supposed to be controlled. That was the assurance given to the public. Heavily redacted documents, thick black bars masking names, locations, flight logs, and associations deemed too sensitive for disclosure. Officials insisted the redactions were necessary, for legal reasons, for personal safety, for the integrity of the process. But that narrative unraveled with alarming speed. Independent researchers, online investigators, and digital analysts quickly discovered a catastrophic failure. With something as simple as copying and pasting the text, the hidden information began to reveal itself. Names emerged, locations resurfaced, connections became visible. The redactions were not secure, they were superficial. The censorship did not merely weaken, it collapsed entirely. What was intended to remain hidden is now circulating freely across social media platforms, independent websites, encrypted messaging channels, and private forums across the globe. The truth is no longer contained, no longer filtered, and no longer manageable. And that loss of control is what truly terrifies the people who spent years, sometimes entire careers, ensuring these details never reach the public. For them, the fear is not exposure alone. It is the realization that the narrative is no longer theirs to control. This is where Mel Gibson's warning becomes impossible to ignore. For decades, he has been telling anyone willing to listen that Hollywood is not what it pretends to be. Not the land of harmless glamour, not a factory of dreams, but a carefully maintained illusion masking something far darker underneath. Now, with the release of the Epstein files, those warnings no longer sound abstract or exaggerated. They feel alarmingly precise. The documents expose deeply disturbing overlaps between the entertainment industry, political power, and elite social circles that were never meant to intersect in public view. Suddenly, claims that were once mocked, dismissed, or ridiculed as conspiracy theories no longer seem so far-fetched. The reaction has been immediate. Powerful individuals are scrambling behind the scenes, issuing carefully worded statements, quietly deleting old content, severing associations, and distancing themselves from people they once proudly called friends. The same. Names keep resurfacing, again and again. And for those who have been paying close attention, this does not feel like chaos. It feels like convergence, the moment when scattered pieces finally lock into place. Mel Gibson did not arrive at these conclusions overnight, nor did they emerge from paranoia or bitterness. His perspective was shaped over decades of first-hand experience inside the system. From the earliest days of his career, long before he became a household name, he sensed something deeply wrong beneath Hollywood's polished surface. Behind the smiles, the applause, and the praise, he observed behavior that felt predatory, manipulative, and fundamentally corrupt. This was long before social media gave whistleblowers a platform or allowed dissenting voices to bypass traditional gatekeepers. Back then, speaking out meant isolation. And when Mel dared to voice his concerns openly, Hollywood responded exactly as powerful systems always do, with ruthless efficiency. Projects quietly disappeared. Doors that were once open suddenly slammed shut. Opportunities evaporated without explanation. He was branded difficult, unstable, and problematic. Labels designed not to debate his claims, but to discredit him entirely. The message was unmistakable: speak out, and you will pay the price. Years ago, Mel Gibson described Hollywood as a bizarre place, one that does not take long to corrupt you. When you first arrive, he said, you are fresh. You are still connected to the real world, still grounded in normal values, still recognizable to yourself. That authenticity is magnetic. People are drawn to it. They celebrate it. They reward it. But that admiration, he warned, is temporary. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, you are pulled into a system that rewards obedience and punishes resistance. You are flattered, indulged, and reassured, all while your boundaries are quietly eroded. Compromises are framed as necessities. Toxic attitudes are normalized. Behaviors that once felt wrong begin to feel routine. And no matter how strong you believe yourself to be, the pressure eventually reshapes you. It diverts you from who you were before you arrived. By the time you realize what has changed, you are already deeply embedded in a machine that does not tolerate dissent and never forgets those who challenge it. When Mel Gibson first arrived in Hollywood in his mid-20s, he expected opportunity, creativity, and artistic freedom. Instead, what he encountered was an overwhelming sense of unease that he could not immediately explain. People behaved differently around him, guarded, cautious, almost rehearsed. Conversations would stop abruptly the moment he entered a room, as if a switch had been flipped. Decisions that affected careers were made behind closed doors, with no transparency and no explanation. He later described the atmosphere as something straight out of a horror film. A strange town with its own unspoken rules, where outsiders are watched carefully, where warnings are delivered in whispers rather than words, and where asking the wrong questions can make you dangerous. At first, he tried to rationalize it. He told himself he was being paranoid. Surely an entire industry couldn't be this dark. Surely this was just the anxiety of a young actor navigating a powerful system. But time has a way of sharpening instincts rather than dulling them. With experience, distance, and reflection, Mel came to understand the truth. The discomfort was not imagined. His instincts had been right all along. The nightmare was real. Eventually, Mel reached a breaking point. He described it simply and bluntly: he had a gut full of the industry. Hollywood no longer felt creative or inspiring. It no longer felt like a place where stories were told for meaning or art. Instead, it felt predatory. Like a vast machine that consumes people, exploits their ambition, and discards them the moment they are no longer useful. That realization was not gradual, it was decisive. And it pushed him to do something few at his level ever do: walk away completely. He left Hollywood behind, moved to Australia, bought land, and returned to physical, honest labor. He dug holes, built fences, worked with animals, lived close to the ground, far from cameras, contracts, and controlled narratives. That separation gave him clarity. Distance stripped away illusion. From the outside, he could finally see Hollywood not as it presents itself to the world, but as it truly was, and more importantly, what it was capable of hiding. Now, decades later, the Epstein files are forcing the world to confront why those warnings mattered. The documents point to deep and deeply troubling connections between Jeffrey Epstein and some of the most powerful individuals on Earth. Among the most striking are the documented associations involving former President Bill Clinton. Newly surfaced photographs show Clinton in relaxed settings alongside Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Victim testimony include. Dead within the files alleges statements attributed to Epstein himself, including claims that Clinton likes them young. The documents reference multiple visits, repeated private jet flights, and even invitations tied to the White House. Taken together, these records stand in stark contrast to years of public denials and carefully worded statements. Whether people are prepared to confront it or not, the material raises questions that can no longer be dismissed as rumor. The pattern is documented. The contradictions are visible. And the silence that once protected these connections is beginning to fracture. And the connections do not stop with politics, far from it. As more material continues to surface, unreleased and quietly circulating photographs place major celebrities, recognizable figures from music, film, television, and the broader entertainment ecosystem, at Epstein's properties and private gatherings. These images span years, sometimes decades, and they paint a picture that is impossible to ignore. To be clear, the presence of an individual in these settings does not automatically equate to criminal wrongdoing. That distinction remains essential, but the broader implication is undeniable. Epstein was not an anomaly drifting at the edges of elite culture. He was deeply embedded within it. He moved comfortably through rooms reserved for the most powerful people in the world. He was welcomed into spaces defined by exclusivity, trust, and influence. He did not merely gain access, he was granted legitimacy. His proximity to fame and power functioned as a shield, reinforcing his position and normalizing his presence in environments that rarely allow outsiders to linger. This level of integration did not happen by chance. Epstein's access was enabled repeatedly, reinforced by introductions, endorsements, and silence. He was protected not by a single institution or individual, but by a network of overlapping interests, political, financial, cultural, and social. Each connection strengthened the next. Each invitation validated the last. Over time, his name became familiar, his presence routine, his background unquestioned. That normalization is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. It reveals how easily power can insulate itself, how quickly proximity can replace scrutiny, and how effortlessly accountability can be deferred when influence is shared. What intensifies the alarm is what occurred after the files were made public. As scrutiny increased and public attention sharpened, anomalies began to appear. Certain documents that were previously accessible quietly disappeared. Links stopped working. Pages were removed or replaced without explanation. In other instances, documents resurfaced with heavy redactions, entire paragraphs consumed by black bars, names erased, dates obscured, and contextual details stripped away. Critics argue that this was not the natural outcome of a legal review process, but a strategic response to exposure, a narrowing of the narrative, a containment effort, not to advance justice, but to manage damage. According to those critics, these actions appear designed to protect reputations that have been carefully constructed over decades, to shield institutions whose authority relies on public confidence, to preserve the standing of individuals who have long operated in spaces where accountability is optional rather than expected. Each redaction feels less like caution and more like intention. Each missing page invites speculation not because of what it says, but because of what it refuses to reveal. Silence in this context becomes its own form of evidence. And this is where the discomfort deepens into something more profound, because the most unsettling question is no longer centered on what has already been exposed. It is about what remains concealed. What information never made it into the public release? What evidence exists in private archives, sealed court records, or undisclosed settlements? What names have been deliberately withheld and whose influence was required to keep them that way? At what level does the power exist to decide which truths are released incrementally and which are deemed too dangerous to surface at all? As fragments of information continue to circulate online, analyzed and reanalyzed by independent researchers, one reality becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. The truth was not erased. It was curated, filtered, shaped, and the effort required to control it suggests that what remains hidden may be just as consequential as what has already come to light. In that sense, the redactions themselves become a warning, not of closure, but of unfinished reckoning. This brings us back to Mel Gibson's strongest and most consistent warning: human trafficking, and in particular, the trafficking of children. He has repeatedly described it as one of the most disturbing and morally catastrophic crimes of the modern world, not only because of its brutality, but because of how effectively it is concealed. According to Gibson, this is not a fringe issue operating in the shadows alone. It is a global crime sustained by silence, power, and willful blindness. That conviction is precisely why he publicly supported the film Sound of Freedom. The film did not rely on spectacle or sensationalism. It focused on exposure, and the reaction it triggered across the entertainment industry was telling. Major streaming platforms declined to promote it. Distribution support evaporated. Disney, which had acquired the film earlier, quietly distanced itself and moved on without explanation. Corporations that routinely amplify social causes, issue statements, and champion awareness campaigns suddenly fell silent. The message was unmistakable. A film exposing child trafficking did not merely risk controversy, it threatened exposure. And exposure in this context was treated as the greater danger. What made the response even more striking was its uniformity. Silence arrived quickly and collectively, as if coordinated by an unspoken understanding. No sustained debate, no public reckoning, just absence. For observers, that absence spoke louder than any condemnation ever could. It suggested that some subjects are not avoided because they are untrue, but because they are too close, too destabilizing to the structures that profit from controlled narratives. In that light, the resistance to Sound of Freedom appeared less like artistic disagreement and more like institutional discomfort. Later, voices outside the traditional Hollywood hierarchy began articulating how this system functions. Joe Rogan and Cat Williams, speaking independently, described the entertainment industry not merely as a creative hub, but as a powerful narrative engine, a propaganda machine in its own right. According to their assessments, success within that system often requires cooperation with entrenched interests. Certain stories are encouraged, amplified, and rewarded. Others are quietly buried, sidelined, or labeled problematic. The boundaries are rarely written down, but they are widely understood. Step outside them and consequences follow. Cat Williams offered one of the most chilling observations of all. He suggested that the true measure of a system is not how it feels or how it presents itself publicly, but whether it works. Patterns, he argued, reveal more than intentions. And when you begin to examine Hollywood through that lens, looking not at individual incidents but at repeated outcomes, the patterns become difficult to ignore. The same topics face resistance. The same voices are marginalized. The same narratives are reinforced. Over time, coincidence gives way to structure. And once those patterns are seen clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee them. Then there is Corey Feldman, whose warnings may be the most heartbreaking of all, not because they are sudden or sensational, but because they have been consistent for most of his life. For decades, Feldman has spoken openly about the abuse of child actors within Hollywood, often at great personal and professional cost. He has never framed his claims as rumor or speculation. He has stated them plainly, repeatedly, and with visible emotional weight. According to Feldman, pedophilia is not a fringe problem operating on the margins of the industry. It is, in his words, Hollywood's biggest secret. A secret maintained not by ignorance, but by silence. He has described growing up in an environment where predators were ever present, where fame and vulnerability existed side by side, and where children were celebrated for their talent while being left dangerously unprotected. Those experiences did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. They followed him into adulthood, shaping his life, his career, and his relentless insistence on speaking the truth. At the center of Feldman's pain is his relationship with his closest friend, fellow child star Corey Haim. Feldman has long believed that the trauma Haim endured as a child actor played a direct role in his later struggles, and ultimately, his untimely death. This belief is not presented as a headline-grabbing accusation, but as a personal reckoning, one that Feldman has carried for years. He has spoken of guilt, grief, and the unbearable sense that the industry failed them both when they needed protection most. And perhaps most chilling of all is Feldman's claim that responsibility traces back to a single powerful Hollywood figure. He has said that naming this individual publicly would come at an unbearable cost, legally, professionally, and personally. The implication is not theatrical, it is sobering. Feldman has suggested that the man responsible knows exactly who he is, and knows that Feldman is still alive, still speaking, still refusing to forget. That quiet tension underscores everything Feldman has ever said. His story is not one of triumph. It is one of survival in a system that punishes memory. When you step back and examine the broader timeline, the pattern becomes increasingly difficult to deny. In the 1990s, Mel Gibson warned that Hollywood's public image concealed something deeply rotten beneath the surface. In the 2000s, Corey Feldman spoke openly about exploitation, abuse, and the devastating cost of telling the truth. These warnings were not welcomed. They were minimized, mocked, or dismissed as personal issues rather than systemic failures. Years later, voices like Cat Williams began predicting that exposure was inevitable, not because people suddenly became braver, but because systems built on secrecy eventually collapse under their own weight. He warned that once the curtain began to lift, it would not stop halfway. Now in 2025, the release of the Epstein files has forced these long-separated warnings into the same frame. What once appeared as isolated testimonies now align along the same structural fault lines. Abuse, cover-ups, silence, power protecting power, different decades, different victims, different voices, yet the same mechanisms repeating again and again. The consistency is what makes it impossible to ignore. These are not random stories colliding by chance. They are echoes of the same system responding the same way each time it is threatened, with denial, suppression, and character assassination. What has changed is not the truth itself, but the environment surrounding it. Information that was once tightly controlled is now fragmented and circulating beyond traditional gatekeepers. Documents escape redaction, testimonies resurface. Patterns become visible to anyone willing to look long enough. The dam that held everything back for decades is no longer intact. It is cracking under accumulated pressure built from years of ignored warnings, buried evidence, and silenced voices. And once that dam breaks, there is no mechanism capable of stopping what follows. Not apologies, not strategic silence, not carefully worded statements. Because when enough people begin to see the same pattern at the same time, the reckoning no longer depends on permission. It becomes inevitable, so now we are left standing at the edge of one final, unavoidable question, one that refuses to fade quietly into the background. Will Mel Gibson, along with the growing number of voices pushing back against the system, finally be able to expose the full truth? Or will Hollywood, an industry that has perfected the art of survival through silence, succeed once again in crushing dissent, discrediting witnesses, and burying what threatens its foundation? For decades, this machine has operated with ruthless efficiency. Those who speak too loudly are labeled unstable. Those who ask the wrong questions are isolated. Careers are quietly dismantled. Invitations stop coming. Opportunities vanish without explanation. And the public, distracted by spectacle and celebrity, is encouraged to move on before the uncomfortable questions take root. This strategy has worked for a very long time. But this moment feels different. For the first time, the pieces are not scattered. They are aligning. The warnings from the past no longer sound like isolated ramblings or conspiracy-driven paranoia. They sound like early signals, like alarms that were ignored for years because acknowledging them would have been too disruptive, too unsettling, too costly. Now those same warnings are being echoed by documents, testimonies, patterns, and undeniable connections that are impossible to dismiss as coincidence. What makes this moment especially dangerous for the system is not just the information itself, but how fast it spreads, how widely it is analyzed, and how difficult it is to contain. The internet does not forget. Screenshots survive deletions, archived files outlive denials, and millions of people are no longer waiting for permission from legacy media to decide what deserves attention. They are watching, comparing, connecting dots in real time. The truth, once exposed to enough light, develops a momentum of its own. It no longer belongs to any one whistleblower, actor, or filmmaker. It becomes collective knowledge. And collective knowledge is far harder to silence than any individual voice. History teaches us systems built on secrecy, protection, and power-shielding power do not collapse overnight, but they always crack first. Hairline fractures appear, narratives begin to shift, public trust erodes, and eventually the pressure becomes impossible to manage. Whether Hollywood is approaching that moment now or merely standing at its threshold remains to be seen. But one thing is clear, the old methods are no longer working the way they used to. The silence feels louder, the denials feel weaker, and the fear, once hidden behind confidence and control, is starting to show. This time, the truth doesn't seem willing to stay buried. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.